All right, guys. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the last webinar in the nutrition webinar series. If this is your first webinar, I invite you to visit our Live Well YouTube page, and they have our other webinars in the series, the past 5 webinars. Some of them include building blocks of human fuel, healthy habits and making them stick, and learning to tune into your hunger and fullness cues. So I'm going to link those in our chat box so you guys have access to that. Now for the series finale, we have a very, very special treat. The executive chef of 38/8, located in New York City, will be showcasing his culinary skills in a very delicious, nutritious recipe. We also have registered dietitian Rebecca Sabine on the webinar to answer any nutrition questions. So you guys are getting the best of both worlds right now. Unlike our other webinars where we usually do Q&A at the end, I encourage you guys to ask questions throughout this webinar. You can leave a question in the chat box. If you don't want to ask, I'll ask the chef or I'll ask Rebecca. But we just want to have fun. We want everybody just to participate in this webinar, and let's go out with a bang. So without any other further ado, I'm going to introduce to you the executive chef of 38/8, Chef David.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Capadonna. I'm the executive chef here at 388 City headquarters in downtown Manhattan. Thank you for having us join you today, the Living Well team, and to do a cooking demonstration and talk about some cooking and to showcase a great recipe that we serve here at our Better For You station. So thank you for having us, and I'd like to get started. So talk about the recipe a little bit. You know, we're using salmon. We're using some fresh ingredients. We have the nutritional information listed on the recipe. So we have a program that we use as we put in the ingredients. It will generate nutritional information for us so that we can follow any guidelines of a station that we particularly have at 388. So our Better For You station is one of those stations that we list our calorie counts and our nutritional information. So that program is great for us. It helps us to generate recipes and innovate with new ideas and different things that allow us to keep within certain calorie guidelines. So the recipe that we chose today is a sesame salmon with Brussels sprouts and a potato and mushroom salad. So what I'll do is I'll walk through the recipe a little bit. I'll talk about each of the ingredients. We'll talk about how you buy some of these items, and at any point, if there are any questions that are sent in, please feel free to ask me. So we're starting out with salmon. A lot of people ask about salmon. A lot of times people always say, what is the best salmon to cook with, or where can I find good salmon, or what do you recommend? So you have a couple of options in the market. You have Atlantic salmon, which is what we're using today. It's always farm raised. There are no wild stock of Atlantic salmon because of the fishing. So farm salmon is what you find when you see Atlantic salmon, and the process for farm raising salmon has come a long way. There's been some great improvements on the impact on the environment and the ability to create a quality product that is good. The other option is wild salmon, which is generally Pacific salmon. So if you see Pacific wild salmon, it may be a particular variety of Pacific salmon. The main difference, a few differences. Atlantic salmon is slightly milder with a little bit less of the robust flavor, where wild salmon is obviously may have a little bit deeper color and be a little bit more robust in flavor. Farm salmon actually has more omega-3s than wild salmon, believe it or not. It does have more calories in it. So that's one thing to consider. The other thing is wild salmon generally has a higher mineral count, and that's due to the fish being able to be in the wild and consume natural foods that would be in their regular environment. And I believe that that's how they are able to increase the mineral count in the wild salmon. So that's salmon, but either way, regardless of what salmon you use, you always want to use a fresh piece of salmon. Of course, everyone loves fresh fish. So if you have the ability to go to a fish store, meet with a fish person, become friendly with them, and try to get some good quality fish, you always want to look for firm flesh fish, something that's not broken. So I'll kind of move this, see if I can move this a little bit closer to the camera. So those are salmon portions. Notice that they're not broken in any way. They're nice and they have a good color. They don't look as though they've been, washed with anything, or they have a nice color. They're firm. When you press on the flesh of the fish, you want it to not break underneath a little bit of resistance. So that's what you like to have. Of course, aroma is a key factor. You want it to smell like the sea or the ocean. You don't necessarily want a strong fish flavor, fish aroma. So those are a couple markers. If you're buying a whole fish, you probably wouldn't buy a whole salmon, but if you do, great. But even if you're buying smaller fish, you want to look for, again, firm flesh, clear eyes. If you can look at the gills that are still intact on the fish, you want them to be nice and bright red. So you just want it to look like a good fish. And when you go to the fish store, you can pick out your fish. You could say, I'd like the one that's second up from the bottom, or, generally fish stores put the best looking fish in the front of the case so that you can see it. And then when you say, I'd love to have a piece of the salmon, then sometimes they take the fish that they have, closer to them. So don't be afraid to pick your piece of fish or pick your salmon fillet and say, I'd like those two on the left. They look the freshest to you. If you get friendly with your fish person, you can always say, what's fresh today? What just came in, or what do you recommend? They're always going to want to recommend a good product for you because they rely on your business. So that's fish. What I have here is I have some 4.5 ounce portions. So we're going to use this fish. We're going to crust it with some sesame seeds. So sometimes people ask me about the spices that we use and the sesame seeds, and what's the best sesame seed to buy? Well, there are several on the market. I have here a mixture of toasted white sesame seeds and black sesame seeds. We like to do a mixture. There's not a huge difference in flavor. It's more of an aesthetic look. Regardless of where you buy your sesame seeds, you want to make sure that it's a place that is maybe busier, so the spices are turning over, so that you have fresh product. Try to buy smaller amounts of those products. If you can buy a small 1 ounce package of sesame seeds, so that after you use them, they're not sitting around in your cabinet at home losing their flavor or losing their quality. So that's the best thing about sesame seeds. Some of the other ingredients we have, these are fingerling potatoes, tricolor. The recipe just calls for regular potatoes, but you can look for smaller potatoes so that when you cut them, the size is almost the same as some of the other ingredients. We have some button mushrooms. Now, when we use the term button mushroom, it basically just refers to regular white mushrooms, but there are many varieties of mushrooms. So like a shiitake mushroom is not considered a button mushroom because the cap is open. Excuse me. The cap is open, so it's not closed like this mushroom, which looks like a button. So button mushrooms, and you can substitute a lot of different things for mushrooms. You can use button mushrooms. You can use cremini mushrooms, which is actually a miniature portobello mushroom. You could use portobello, full-grown portobello mushrooms. You could use shiitake mushrooms, oyster mushrooms. Again, it would change the nutritional information on this recipe, but those are all variations of what you can do with the mushrooms. Or you could do a mixture if you like to do some regular mushrooms, cremini mushrooms, oyster mushrooms all together. It changes the dish a little bit. So some other things, Brussels sprouts. What we're going to talk about, when you look for Brussels sprouts, sometimes you can find them in the store, or if you go to a local farm market, they have a whole branch with all of the Brussels sprouts still attached. Looks really, really cool. And it's also good because the Brussels sprout is not cut from the branch yet. So you know that it's basically still attached, and it hasn't started to lose any of its quality from a removal standpoint. When you buy Brussels sprouts, you want to look for ones that are nice and tight, not too loose. Good size, real big ones aren't great, and little tiny ones aren't great, because you want something that's equal in size so that when you work with it, you can cut them to the right size. You want to look at the base of the Brussels sprout, and you want to make sure that it's not too brown, doesn't look old or dry, so that it appears that it's been cut off the stem for a long time. So you want to make sure that you have a nice, fresh, firm Brussels sprout with a good-looking base that looks fresh. Okay, so let's talk about the recipe a little bit. So
Chef,
I'm using, yes.
we have a question in the chat box. So is the salmon skin on or off for this recipe?
I have the skin off. So the recipe calls for the salmon, but it doesn't say skin attached. It's optional. You can leave the skin on. It may change the nutritionals a little bit, but primarily for this recipe, we use skin off.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. So with the salmon, what we're going to do is, the first part of the recipe says to preheat your oven to 350 degrees. So that's a good temperature because it's not too high and it's not too low. That's what we're going to use to roast the mushrooms. So in the recipe, we use the term dry roasting. So what that means is it's just the mushrooms laid out on a baking sheet and roasted in a 350 degree oven. So that it doesn't change the nutritional information in this recipe. Also, a lot of times if you're not focused primarily on nutritionals, you can add a little bit of olive oil. So if you were roasting something, if a recipe calls for roasting, a little bit of extra virgin olive oil drizzled on some vegetables that are roasted in the oven are great. You want to have kind of a medium to transfer the heat from the oven to whatever you're roasting. And that's where the use of an oil comes in, or an olive oil. So dry roasting is one technique we use when we are specific about nutritional ingredients in a recipe. When we're just cooking, not so focused on that, we can use some sort of medium to transfer the heat. So the Brussels sprouts, we'll talk about the Brussels sprouts. I talked about the quality. So this recipe calls for Brussels sprouts to be quartered. So what I would do is I would trim the base and then make sure I have a nice clean cut on the base. And then if there are any outer leaves that are loose, I just peel those away so that I have a nice clean Brussels sprout. And then what I can do is just cut it right into quarters like this. Just so I have nice small pieces of Brussels sprouts cut into quarters. Okay, so pretty simple technique. We trim the end, we remove the leaves, and then we just cut it into quarters. Okay, if you have a small trash bin, it's good to put a little trash bin on your counter and use that to put your trimmings in. If you have the ability to compost at home, that's great. This is great for composting.
Is there any reason that you're cutting it into quarters?
There is actually. So I could cut it different ways. I like to cut the vegetable into quarters because it's going to match the size of the other vegetables. So I'm going to cut the mushrooms in quarters. I'm going to slice the potatoes to a thickness that's similar. So when we cut vegetables, when chefs start to cook, we usually visualize a finished dish and then work backwards from that. So we always are thinking about the dish itself in its finished state, but we also think about the process of eating it. So some of the reasons you would cut vegetables this way or in a particular way, say quartered Brussels sprouts, quartered mushrooms, several reasons. One is the cooking time is very similar, so that the mushrooms cook similar time that the Brussels sprouts would cook. Most importantly is think about when you're eating the dish, and if you've ever had a dish where there's been, say, grilled corn cut off of the cob and then large pieces of Brussels sprouts or large pieces of butternut squash. And when you go to eat that dish, it's easy to scoop the corn, but then you're chasing that one big piece of Brussels sprout around the plate. And that's really adds to like the eatability. I'm not sure if that's a word, but the eatability of a dish. So part of cooking and part of eating, you engage all of your senses, and how the dish eats is very important. So that's why we would cut the Brussels sprouts to match the mushrooms and to match the potatoes, so that the cooking time is consistent, and that when you're eating the dish, it's easier to eat. So we think of the dish in its finished state, and we like to have the vegetables the same size. So Brussels sprouts cut, and then mushrooms. Okay, so mushrooms, same thing. When you look for mushrooms, you want to, if you're buying just plain button mushrooms, you want really nice, bright mushrooms, not a lot of dirt on them or soil that they've been grown in. It's okay to take a damp cloth and wipe mushrooms down. I generally don't like to put them in a lot of water because they already have a lot of water, a very high water content, and they're absorbent. So if you're floating them in a lot of water, they have a tendency to absorb all of that water, and they just don't, it doesn't add anything to the dish. So look for clean ones, very clean ones to begin with, and then if you want to take a damp cloth that's been, just moistened with water and wipe off any outside dirt that's there, it's going to be just fine. So again, same thing. If the mushroom, just trim up the base of the mushroom so you get a nice clean cut, and then go ahead and do the same thing. Just quarter the mushrooms so that you get equal size, because we want to have the same size so that they cook evenly and cook consistently the same amount of time. Okay, so very simple. This is a super simple dish. The cuts are easy. The process is very easy. So the mushrooms, the Brussels sprouts. So the potatoes, for this particular dish, we chose to do tricolor fingerling potatoes, which are, odd-shaped potatoes that kind of look like fingers. They're a little bit longer. This variety of potato is very popular, very flavorful. They also have a tricolor potato mix that are just round, small potatoes. Sometimes they're called peewee potatoes or peanut potatoes. You can find them in some specialty supermarkets. So potatoes, what we did here was we took them, because we had fingerlings, and we sliced them to a size that we thought would steam easily and be very similar to the thickness of the Brussels sprout and would steam. So we cook these vegetables separately because they have different cooking times. A potato takes sometimes a little bit longer to cook than a Brussels sprout. So we want to steam those separately so that we can make sure one vegetable doesn't overcook while we're waiting for the other one to cook. So we have our potatoes already cut and steamed. So steaming at home, you know, in the commercial kitchen, we have machinery that helps us cook. You know, we have a cabinet that is a steamer. So we have the ability to take a pan that has holes in it, put it inside this cabinet and close the door, and it creates a lot of steam, and that's how we cook large batches of food. At home, we do it a little bit differently. You may have a steamer basket that you put over a pot of boiling water. You can use that to steam vegetables. Sometimes the cookware companies sell a steamer pot. So it's a pot with another pot that fits inside of it that has holes that lets the steam come up. So steaming is very important because we don't lose a lot of the nutrients in the vegetables when we steam versus just boiling the vegetables. If you don't have any of that equipment at home, something that I do at home to just easily steam vegetables is I'll cut the vegetables to the size that I like. I'll put them in a bowl, 2 tablespoons of water. I'll cover it with a plate, and I'll put it in the microwave for about 2 minutes. And believe it or not, they come out perfectly steamed. I don't lose a lot of nutrients because I used a small amount of liquid. And, you know, in the end, I just drain off the little bit of liquid. Be careful when you do that because liquid is hot. And I have great steamed vegetables with no mess. I don't have to wash a pot afterwards. It's just, you know, very simple. So that's how I do it at home. Very, very simple. So let's talk about some of our other ingredients. Kosher salt. So in the commercial kitchen, we like to use kosher salt. There are a lot of other salts out there on the market. You know, you have sea salt, you have iodized salt, and then you have a whole line of other salts like pink Himalayan sea salt and volcanic, you know, Hawaiian salt. And there's a huge line of salts out there. So primarily, we use kosher salt in the commercial kitchen because it's a larger grain and it takes a little longer to dissolve. So we like to use that to season food. It's not super salty. And it kind of adds a nice crunch to the food. This kosher salt, in comparison to something like sea salt, which is a little bit finer, or you can buy sea salt in larger crystals, is very good for just finishing a dish. So when you want to experience the crunch of some salt, or you know, a dish that has the correct amount of salt, and you would like to just highlight some of the flavors with a touch of sea salt on top. You know, Maldon sea salt is very popular. It's very large flake, a couple of flakes just on top of the dish, so that your first couple of bites, you get that burst of salt. Iodized salt has been around for a long time. It's also known as table salt. It's usually what's found in like a salt shaker. So a long time ago, someone thought that it was that the human diet was deficient in iodine, and they thought that the health benefit would be to how do we get more iodine in everyone's diet? And they thought to themselves, well, what's one thing that everyone uses or one thing that everyone eats? And they came up with salt. So they said, let's add iodine to the salt so that people can get more iodine in their diet. You know, not really necessary. So, you know, iodized salt is okay, but we don't really use it for anything. It tends to be very salty. You don't need the additional iodine supplement in the salt. So, stick with kosher salt. Use a little bit of course, sea salt at the end to finish dishes. Try out some of those other great salts, the Hawaiian pink salt and the black Hawaiian salt. Some great stuff out there. Let's talk about vinegar. Okay, this recipe calls for sherry vinegar. So we're using sherry vinegar, which is vinegar that's made from sherry wine. So sherry wine is a wine that is fortified with additional alcohol. So that's a little bit of a higher alcohol content. Once the wine is produced, it's put into barrels and it's aged to reach vinegar. So what you have here is sherry vinegar. It's a little bit more mild. The best ones are imported from Spain. So if you're going to buy a nice sherry vinegar, look for one that's imported from Spain. And you can use it not only for this recipe, but it's great in vinaigrette dressings. It's great to add a little brightness to dishes. So that's why we use sherry vinegar in this recipe, because it adds a little bit of a brightness to the dish. It also balances out some of the other flavors like oil. So if you've ever tasted just a tablespoon of oil, it's not very delicious. It kind of coats your tongue. But if you've tasted a really great salad dressing, you know that there's a balance. So that balance is the vinegar. So some sort of acid that we add to the dish. You can substitute sherry vinegar in this particular dish. You could use red wine vinegar. You could use cider vinegar, white vinegar, balsamic vinegar. So there are a lot of vinegars on the market that you can use to substitute. You could use lemon juice. So again, it's about, sherry vinegar is a little bit milder than the other vinegars, so it adds a nice flavor. But you could substitute really any vinegar or any type of acidic flavor to balance out the olive oil. So that's what we use the vinegar for, right?
Chef, I'm sorry, is there a shelf life for sherry vinegar?
There is. When you purchase something like a sherry vinegar, it has a pretty long shelf life. You could probably keep it for 3 to 6 months in your pantry once it's open. After that, it doesn't necessarily go bad, but it starts to lose its quality and starts to, not be as good. So whenever you purchase something like that, if you're not going to use it right away or a lot of it, try to find a smaller amount so that you're always turning over your ingredients and making fresh items.
Okay, so just a heads up, everyone, we have about 8 minutes left to our webinar. If you have any questions for the chef or you have any questions for Rebecca, this is the time. Just go in the chat box and you can ask any question.
Okay, so I'll be listening, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and make the dish so you can see it, and then we can have a finished product. So the recipe calls for the salmon crusted with the sesame seeds. You can take the sesame seeds and you want to press them onto the fish. So notice I don't have anything rubbed on the fish. If you wanted to, you could use a little bit of the olive oil from the recipe and just brush that on the fish. It will help the fish stick together with the sesame seeds. You could also use a little bit of egg white, again, changing the nutritionals in the dish, but you could use egg white to brush onto the fish to help this stick. You could also brush a little mustard, Dijon mustard on it. It would change the flavor a little bit and change the nutritionals, but those are techniques that we use to have things adhere to the fish as we cook with them. If you don't like sesame seeds or you're allergic to sesame seeds, you can always substitute, finely chopped walnuts, finely chopped almonds, chia seeds, sunflower seeds. So there are a lot of different options. So once your fish is crusted, with the sesame seeds. We'll go ahead and put that in the oven. So as the fish is roasting, we're going to go ahead and make the salad. So we're going to use our Brussels sprouts, our roasted mushrooms, our potatoes, I like to use the chopped fresh parsley, bit of salt, kosher salt, sherry vinegar, some extra virgin olive oil. Sometimes people ask, what's the difference between extra virgin olive oil and virgin olive oil or just olive oil? Extra virgin olive oil is the very first pressing of the olives. So it's the first oil that comes from the olive. It's the most pungent, and it's the most highly sought after. They press the olives again, and they come up with something that's just called olive oil. I'll take it around. It's just something that's called olive oil, and then on down the line to like pomace and the different oils. So if you're looking for a good oil, you want to do extra virgin. It's good for finishing a dish. It has the most pungency. Extra virgin olive oil is not good for sautéing because it has a lower smoke point. And what that means is when you heat an oil on the stove, it gets to a certain temperature where it starts to smoke. And every oil has a different smoke point. Olive oil has a very low one. So it's difficult to saute or sear something in pure extra virgin olive oil because it doesn't have a very high smoke point. You want to use something like a canola oil, which is on the healthier side. We've used peanut oil. We've used, other oils, vegetable oil. The health benefits obviously aren't there with those oils, so try to avoid them. Canola oil works well because it has a higher smoke point, and you can saute with it. So I'm going to add a little bit of black pepper. Some people ask me sometimes, what's the difference between coarse ground and fine ground? I always use a pepper mill because you can adjust the grind all depending on what you want. And also it's ground fresh each time. If you buy a big bin of ground pepper, sometimes it's been on the shelf for a long time. Once you open it, it starts to lose its flavor. So spices, you want to have just some nice, buy yourself a nice pepper mill, and you'll always have fresh ground pepper. So I have all the ingredients here in the dish. I'm going to mix it up. Very simple. I'll do a small presentation. So once you have this salad, we add this to the dish as the base. I have some salmon already cooked.
Chef, can you roast with extra virgin olive oil?
You can roast with extra virgin olive oil. Just because it's more of a gentle heat than just the direct flame. So roasting in the oven is good to use extra virgin olive oil, or just a regular olive oil. You don't necessarily spend $25 on a really great bottle of olive oil to use it to roast. Look for maybe a less expensive olive oil if you're going to roast stuff, and save the really nice olive oil. So just like this dish, I have the roasted mushrooms and some steamed vegetables. If I wanted to, I could always take a really good olive oil like this one and just kind of finish the dish a little bit with it. The health benefits of extra virgin olive oil are great. You can always add a little bit to the dish to help finish. So this is our finished dish. It is the salmon with the roasted mushrooms, Brussels sprouts, and potatoes. Very simple dish, nice ingredients, great ingredients.
We have less than a minute on this webinar, but thank you so much, Chef David, for joining us today. This was so, I mean, I've learned so much. I'm sure everyone else has learned so much as well. If you guys have any more questions or feedback, please reach out to livewellfitness@citi.com. If you have any questions for Rebecca, please reach out to Rebecca at rebecca.sabine@citi.com. This was great, guys. Hopefully we have more in the future. The meal looks great. And it's still going. I don't know when it's going to cut off. I mean, we're still here. If anybody has any last minute questions, this is the time.
Thank you. Thank you very much.